listening to Raising the Bets. We're a Catholic couple raising 5 kids outside of Boston. Join us as we share the joys and challenges of marriage, homeschool, and our adventures near and far as we make sense of the world and experience the best parts of our culture. I'm Don Bettinelli.
And I'm Melanie Bettinelli.
This is going to be a different episode of Raising the Bets because I got some bad news today that my dad died. My dad passed away. My dad, who is Domenico Senior, it was elderly, it was sudden, but he was 89, so not unexpected. So I wanted to make a little different episode. It was either we'd not do an episode at all, or and I know you'd all understand, or maybe do one that's a little bit just a chance for me to talk a little bit about my dad, and so get a little bit of, I don't know, processing, closure, whatever term you want to use. So yeah. So where to begin? I guess at the end. My dad passed away today. He'd gone to the hospital. He lived with my brother, and he was not feeling well yesterday. He had a stomach ache, and at 89 years old, everything is, can be the big thing, which it turns out it was. And they took him to the local hospital. They found an infection. They'd been him overnight. Things were a little worse. Things were a little better. And then he just suddenly was gone. I guess at one point he had gotten up from bed to go to the restroom. And as he got back to the bed, he was saying, when can I go home? Asking that sort of thing, and sat down, and then, as they say, coded. His heart stopped, basically. And then he was gone. And that was, as we say, in the hour of mercy. I think it was 3:45. So in case you're not familiar, the hour of mercy is the hour that Jesus died on the cross, between 3 and 4 o'clock. And I was on my way in. My brother had called me immediately as things had happened, and so I dropped everything and went in. He was already gone by the time I got there. Both of my brothers and my sister one of my sisters was there when I got there. My other sister lives in Maine, so she's obviously couldn't be there, and she actually has a cold, so she couldn't come down anyway, unfortunately. They wouldn't let her in the hospital.
Right.
In COVID things. So, let's talk a little bit first, I guess. I'm kind of winging it. How'd the kids handle it when I ran out?
They're all very sad.
Yeah, I imagine. Some took it harder.
Yeah, Ben seemed to be especially hard, and Bella was crying at dinner.
Yeah.
Coincidentally, you made your dad's pasta sauce for dinner tonight.
Yeah, my dad's recipe. Yeah.
So you started that before we went to mass this morning, and that's what we ended up having for dinner. And the kids told some Nanu stories, and yeah. Well, while you were gone, I went ahead and prayed the office for the dying and for the dead, and then went ahead and said evening prayer. So I spent a lot of time in prayer. I just lit a candle on our prayer table, and the kids kind of some of them sat with me and just kind of listened and did their thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is the first time any of them has lost anybody.
Anybody
close,
right? Any family member.
So
yeah,
for them, this is
I was Lucy's age when my dad's dad died. My Nanu. I didn't know him as well as even Lucy does. Frankly, I'm glad. In recent years, we'd spent more time with him than in previous years. He had moved in with my brother, so was closer by. We saw him more often than we'd had before. So I'm glad of that.
Yeah, Ben was remembering that his first meeting with your dad was he got scared because your dad has a very loud voice and he ran off to my sister to comfort him.
Yeah, my dad had the big Italian voice. He came into the room and was the center of attention.
Yep.
So my dad was 89 and would have turned 90 this December.
Your family was planning a big
celebration. We were
birthday
gonna,
party.
A huge party, hotel catered, the whole 9 yards. So we'll have to, I was saying we should still do something for him on his birthday.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. He was a Korean War Navy vet, very proud of it, wore his hat everywhere.
All over the place.
Yeah, he had one of those Korean War vets hats on his hat that he had. They're good. We're going to put it in the casket with him because he never went anywhere without it. Got plenty of free meals with that. And he worked at Raytheon, which is a defense contractor based in Massachusetts, for 50 years. He was a millwright, which is kind of like a machinist, but also they specialize in moving things around, big things, like radar dishes for ships, that sort of thing. I gathered that he tried to explain it over the years to me. I think he explained it as well as I explained podcasting to him. So I remember one time driving him a few years ago when I first started doing this full time, driving him to a doctor's appointment and trying to explain to him what a podcast was. And the best thing I do was it's like radio, but it's on your phone. Yeah, he was still dubious, but he's one of 14 children, although it's a little deceptive because only 8 of them survived past childhood. But his parents, my grandparents, were born in Sicily. In fact, by coincidence, the day before my dad died would have been his dad's 134th birthday. My grandfather was born in the 1800s, which is really weird to say. I mean, for those of you who are younger, that's got to be really weird. That's like saying my granddad was George Washington's aide or something. It's a long time ago, even to me. And they were born in Sicily, grew up from there, and came to this country. My dad was born here. He was born in Boston, and he had 8 children, 5 with my mom and 3 with another woman named Mary Ellen who died a few years ago. My parents divorced about 35 years ago, but in recent years, after Mary Ellen passed away, my dad and my mom reconciled and were close again, which was really nice. So that was a huge consolation. My father had 2 favorite sayings. We were talking about this. It was my siblings. So his first favorite saying was, "Did anybody ever tell you they loved you today?"
I was saying at dinner, I'm going to be really sad to never hear him say that to me again, because he always greeted me with, "Did anyone ever tell you they loved you today?"
Mm-hmm. And his other favorite saying was, "It costs you nothing to be kind." So, my dad was always the biggest personality in the room. He was outgoing, gregarious, friendly, boisterous. As a younger man, always looking for the good score. I have some stories I want to tell in a bit about that my dad had told me about his younger years, his adventures he's had. But that kind of will tell you a little about him. But one of the bad things was, as a young man, he was a smoker. He was like a multiple pack a day smoker when I was a kid, and he had several heart attacks and a stroke, and yet he lived to 89, and it was in pretty good health most of that time, most of the past 30 years or so. But 30 years ago, about 30, 29 and a half years ago, he had a heart attack that required quintuple bypass.
Quintuple?
Yes, which in early 90s, 1993, was a very low percentage survivability. In fact, my brother John was reminding me that the doctors gave him a 5% chance of survival.
Wow.
I was at school at the time in Steubenville and flew home. I remember John picked me up at the airport, drove me to the hospital, and we stayed at the hospital basically for the next 36 hours. And he wasn't sure he was going to make it. So, and he knew that his situation where he might, leaving my mom, put him in a bad spot spiritually, and wanted to do something about it. So my brother, who at the time worked for the Archdiocese of Boston, he contacted a priest who contacted the cardinal at the time, Cardinal Law, and the cardinal told the priest what needed to be done. And the priest went into my dad. And actually, the priest is now Bishop Robert Reed. It was Father Reed at the time. Went into my dad and had him, make a good confession, be reconciled, and, got the anointing of the sick. So as far as we're concerned, that was all settled 30 years ago. But yeah, it was something, that scare. In fact, the nice thing was when I got to the hospital today, there was a priest in there with him and giving him the anointing of the sick. They give a conditional anointing because we don't know exactly the moment at which, spiritually speaking, a person is dead. We know when, we have a medical definition, heart stops, that sort of thing. But from a spiritual perspective, we don't have a definite, this is when it happens. And don't forget, the body is not just a shell that we inhabit. The body is us. So when our body is still there, we are there. In a way, soul and body are separated, but we're still there. That's still us, which is a whole lot of this other stuff having to do with, wanting to change our identities, and our body we're in the wrong body, that sort of stuff. That's all nonsense. We are our body. So this great priest, Father Martin, I think he was from Holy Trinity Parish in Quincy, had come in and given him the anointing of the sick. He was on call. So that was really nice. So, that's my dad in a nutshell. So I wanted to tell some stories to kind of give you a sense of who my dad was. He grew up in Boston's north end. He grew up in Boston's West End. The north end of Boston is known as the Italian neighborhood. It's the Little Italy of Boston. But there used to be a neighborhood. They got torn down in the 60s because of quote unquote urban renewal. But there was a neighborhood called the West End of Boston that was a melting pot. It had people from all over: Lithuanians, Italians, Poles, Irish. Everybody lived in that neighborhood, including one Leonard Nimoy. Mm-hmm. I've told you that story. Leonard Nimoy, who some might know better as Mr. Spock from Star Trek, is from Boston. He was a neighbor. My dad knew him. They weren't friends. I mean, they lived on different streets, but he knew him. He knew of him. He was a little older than my dad, I think. And so that he grew up in the West End. So when my dad was a kid in the early 40s, he used to sell newspapers in Boston's North Station in the nearby hotel. My dad called it Manger or Manger. I'm not sure if that's the actual name, but that's what my dad called it. And he was selling the hotel bar. And being a cute Sicilian kid, about 8 or 10 years old, with a huge personality and being extremely polite, he would earn more tips than all the other boys because he was so polite, to all the men at the bar. So one day, a bunch of the rich guys in the hotel bar were amused by the polite Sicilian kid selling them papers. And one of them asked him, "What's the biggest tip you've earned today?" And it was a $50. But my dad was no dummy. So he said, "A quarter." So the guy said to my dad, "Here's a $10 tip on one condition: you have to sing God Bless America." My dad was telling the story. He said, "I would have sang him the whole Irving Berlin oeuvre for $10, which is like the equivalent of $100 today, before government caused inflation. Probably more than that even." So after earning the tenner, my dad ran home to give the money to his mother, like he did with all the money he earned. That was, those kids were out there earning money for the family, not for their pocket. And when she saw it, she was upset at first. She told him, "Run back right now and give it back." She told him, "He must be drunk and his wife will be mad at him. He gave away so much money."
I love the fact that she has so much concern for the supposedly drunk guy's wife.
Yes, because such a low opinion of these rich guys at the bar, like idiot men, No, my dad told her, these guys are millionaires. They can afford it. And she says, in that case, why didn't you get more money? It's very practical. So, I mean, it's a nice sum of my dad a little bit. Wherever we went, we joked that my dad we'd meet somebody my dad knew. And it was true. We would go to northern Maine. We'd be on vacation up in Maine, and we'd be at a diner. I remember this happening, and someone came in and was like, Dominic, from across the restaurant. We were at Disney World, and some guy came up and knew my dad. It was like this thing. It was incredible. He just had this gift of gab. He liked people, was totally outgoing, and people liked him. And so it was just a thing with my dad. And then, as a young man, it was more like a young man sort of thing. And then he became the cute old man, and people would relate to him in that way. So it was really nice. And like my brother Bernie was saying that every time he would go to church on Sunday without my dad, for whatever reason, whether he's, visiting my sister or something like that, people would ask, like, is your dad okay? Was your dad coming? Was your dad, they just were. So people knew him. He wasn't one of these people that kind of faded into the background.
No, your dad never faded into the background.
Nope. He was notoriously thrifty. I'm using thrifty. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to say cheap, but he was one of the proverbial people who grew up into the Great Depression, poor. At restaurants, what I remember as a kid, he would, how they have the little things with all the sugar packets? He would take all the sweet and low packets, and they would give them to my mom and say, "Here, put this in your purse." And she's like, "Tony, no, that's stealing." She's like, "No, they're going to throw them away anyway. Just put them in your purse." Like, they're going to throw them away. In fact, at the hospital today, it was really nice. It was Milton Hospital is the hospital he was at. When we were in the room with him after he'd passed, the hospital staff brought in a cart full of sodas and coffee and some snacks and stuff for us, just to be nice. It was this really nice thing. And so with the coffee was this big basket of sugar packets. I was like to my sister-in-law Patty, I'm like, "Here, Patty, in honor of my dad, put all this in your purse." So in recent years, like I said, my dad lived with my older brother Bernie, and he got around on a mobility scooter. He had this little red scooter, which Bernie said this morning he'd been fixing up for him and cleaning for him for when he got home. And every day, weather permitting, because it's New England, he would drive his scooter a mile up the street to the church for mass, daily mass, and then he would sit outside by the Marian Grotto to say his prayers. And he would say God was keeping him around this long so that he would pray for everyone he knew that needed prayers. And he had this long list. He had a booklet, and he literally had all these names in it and all these people that he'd known over the years. And he would pray for them all by name every day. And as he would say, a lot of them needed it. His old buddies who were in the mob and that sort of stuff. Yeah. So his faith had become very important to him later in life. Do you remember when he broke his leg 5 or 6 years ago, like right before he went to live with Bernie? That was
right. Yeah. And
so he was in this rehab hospital. He was bored out of his mind. He didn't bored of the TV. Couldn't hear the TV because he was deaf as a doornail. And someone started giving him saint books.
I think Evie did.
I think my sister Evie gave him these saint books. Was it the Daughters of St. Paul?
Yeah, the
saint books were like for adolescents, kids, for teens or preteens.
Preteens, like these were the very, very short chapter books.
Yeah.
The series is
forget.
Yeah.
Well, in any case, there are dozens of them, but all these different saints, and he devoured them. And we brought some of ours in, and he devoured all those. And he just loved them. And for him, in many ways, learning all this stuff was new to him. Like he was just learning all this stuff about the faith that he'd never gotten, when he was younger. So he just got so excited. Do you hear about this guy, Pier Giorgio Frassati? He was like, he was just getting excited about it.
I think I remember that he told one of the nurses about one of the saints that particularly struck him, and she got excited, and he ended up lending the book to her.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, evangelizing. So he used to live in this town called Southborough before he moved in with my brother. Of course, he knew everybody in that town, and he got to be friends with a former commander of the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, which is the oldest commissioned naval warship in the world. It's this old sailing ship, frigate that's in Boston Harbor.
One of the first commissioned ships for when the U.S. was a new country.
Yes, it was one of the first 4 U.S. naval ships commissioned after the country was founded, built for the purpose. And it still exists. Old Ironsides, you can go on it today. And a couple times a year, they take it on what they call turnaround cruises. They tow it out by tugboat into the harbor, turn it around, and bring it back in so that it gets even weathering. There's one side, so it's not one side facing the weather all the time. Okay. And these turnaround cruises become opportunities to invite special guests aboard, and you have, they usually have a lottery where people can, win tickets because it's in high demand to be on board. And then other dignitaries and important people are on board. And the big one is always the 4th of July. That's the big turnaround cruise that everyone wants to go. Well, about, I'd say 12 or 14 years ago, Bella was a baby. I forget what it was, but exactly when. Actually, it's on the wall here. I should take a look, but he got tickets, 2 tickets, and I got to go with him. And it was awesome. Like, I love the Constitution. It is my favorite thing in Boston. The opportunity to go aboard and to sail on it. I mean, Melanie can tell you, I love sailing ships. I love the old square rigged sailing vessels, Aubrey Maturin and C.S. Forster, the Horatio Hornblower series of books. I mean, all that stuff. Love it. So to be on board was so amazing. And like, there were Medal of Honor winners. They had that year, I think the Medal of Honor Society was in Boston meeting that weekend. And so they were piping aboard dignitaries, captains and admirals. And of course, the highest honors go actually to the Medal of Honor winners. They come aboard last and get piped aboard, and they get a 21-gun salute and that whole thing. And one of the things you can do is if you make a donation, you can get a flag that flew aboard the ship on that cruise. That turnaround cruise, and I actually have one mounted on my wall in a special case from that, which is a treasure. I mean, and not least because I got to do that with my dad, so it was really nice. One last story, I think, before I bore everybody to death. Back in 1999, I got to go to Rome. I think it was 99. Might have been April of 2000. Anyway. I got to go to Rome with my brother, John, my sister, Francesca, and my dad. So I told you my brother worked for the Archdiocese of Boston. He worked in their youth ministry, and he helped organize the World Youth Day pilgrimages. And there was a big, year 2000 third millennium World Youth Day going to be in Rome that summer of 2000. So he would always take a preliminary trip to, assess the hotels and, do all that logistical stuff. And so we decided to, see if we could go along, and we took my dad, which was kind of awesome. It was such at that point, it was still, how do I say it? My parents split up in the 80s, mid 80s. And when that happened, when the divorce happened, for a long time, I didn't really see my dad much at all. We didn't really have a connection with him. I would see him at holidays. He came to my graduation from Steubenville. There was we saw him. We would have big family events like weddings or whatnot. But this trip was a really nice opportunity to reconnect with my dad. And it was a short trip. It's only a few days. But as an example, by the way, of my kind of going back to where my dad knows everybody. Mm-hmm. We're walking through Trastevere, which is the one of the oldest sections of Rome, It's the Jewish ghetto, really picturesque. Santa Maria in Trastevere is an amazing church there. And my dad is wearing his jacket from the West End Association. All the people who live in the West End belong to the West End Society, and so he had his jacket that said West End of Boston. And guy comes up and goes, are you from the West End of Boston? This American guy. Like, yeah. He's like, that's my dad's from there. Blah, blah, blah. So we start talking, and then we had been looking for a place to go for dinner, and so we're like, hey, can you recommend a good place for dinner? He's like, of course, follow me. And he takes us down these streets, and he takes us to this restaurant. I'll never forget it, La Cisterna. And he goes to the door. He goes, this is the oldest restaurant in Trastevere. It might be the oldest in Rome. And because it's like over 300 years old. And he says to the guy at the door, says, these are my friends, because now we're his friends. Please take care of them. Oh, we got the most amazing dinner you could imagine. It was probably the best dinner I've ever had in my life. It was fantastic. But it was such a great opportunity. My dad, whose command of the Italian language was minimal at best. I mean, he spoke a pidgin Sicilian. Like Sicilian to like a Roman Italian is kind of like deep woods Louisiana Cajun to French. I mean, it's considered pretty rustic. So my dad was always kind of a little leery of using it. But when he did, I mean, he really would sometimes, take a leap of faith, and it worked out. One of my favorite pictures of him at top of St. Peter's, we climbed up to the dome up top and looked out over the city, and just me and him there at St. Peter's. In fact, I might use the picture of him and I for the cover art for this episode. In what's the big square? Navona, Piazza Navona, that my brother took of us together. So, yeah. So the funeral was expected to be, later this week. My dad is going to be buried at the National Cemetery in Bourne, Massachusetts. That's the U.S. military as a veteran. He can be buried there. So as far as the SQPN stuff, folks, I mean, I'm going to do my best to get out the things that are time sensitive, but we might be a little bare bones this week as we deal with the disruption. I'm sure everyone understands. Your prayers for the repose of my dad's soul would be most appreciated. Any prayers for my family and prayers for my mom. My mom has dementia and is in an assisted living facility, and she doesn't know yet, and we're not sure the best way to tell her, because we're afraid that when we tell her, it will, well, to be quite frank, probably kill her. It will cause her to decline rapidly. So we're trying to figure out the best thing for her, the best thing to do, because we don't want to lie to her. But she's going to wonder where my dad is, that he hasn't come to visit her or talk to her. So your prayers for that situation would be greatly appreciated as well. I did most of the talking. Sorry.
That's okay. It's your dad. If it was mine, I would be doing most of the talking.
Yeah. We had other stuff we were going to talk about, but we'll come back to it. We had some good food stuff to talk about. The Sunday gravy came out really good.
Well, actually, we should talk about the Sunday gravy because that was a perfect timing.
So for those who don't know, Sunday gravy is what...
It's nothing at all like what you think gravy is.
It's not gravy. It's just, you put it out of your mind. When you heard the word gravy, it is not what you're thinking of, unless you know what I'm talking about. Sicilian Americans especially had this tradition of a spaghetti sauce. They called it gravy because they wanted to fit in. They wanted to Americanize it. But it's basically a meat spaghetti sauce, but a fancy meat spaghetti sauce. It's not ground beef in it. That would cook for hours and hours, maybe even overnight from Saturday to Sunday, to be served as part of the big Sunday meal. A lot of work and expense for the time would go into it. And so that's it. I got this Sunday gravy moniker. So and I've written about it on my blog. I think I've talked about it on the podcast once before. I may have, forgive me if you've heard this before. So the way you make it is you basically have multiple kinds of meats. There's always Italian sausage. You can have usually some pork, some beef on the bone. Some fattier cuts might be fine because it's all going to braise and break down in the cooking anyway. So what I had today was I had some sweet Italian sausage, I had some country style pork rib, boneless, and I had a chuck roast. And you basically brown it all off. Then you put some, you take those out, set them aside. You take some onion, and I usually grate a carrot for some sweetness. And I saute that in the pan, add some garlic. Then I add in a can of tomato paste. And then I add crushed tomatoes and some wine and a bunch of herbs, thyme, oregano, fennel, rosemary, and anise seed. And then, just bring it up to a simmer, put all the meat back in, and then you put it in the oven at 325. So you're in a big Dutch oven. So you put it in the oven and let it simmer for hours. 2 hours is probably sufficient. Like if I were going to do like an overnight one, I'd lower the temp in the oven to like maybe 200, like a really low temp.
Right.
But a couple hours at 325 is probably sufficient. And it gets so dark and rich and so tasty. It's probably the richest spaghetti sauce you'll ever eat. And it reminds me of being a kid going to my grandma's house or going to my aunt's house and, sitting down, there'd be all kinds of pastas and all kinds of food, and, cold cuts and, you name it, olives and whatever. And it'd be meat, Sunday gravy on ziti usually. And that would be the meal. So I just had a hankering I hadn't made it in a while. It's a nice, like colder weather food. You don't make it in the summer. It's too hot. But the fall's here and I just had been having a hankering to making it again. And, it was just the right time to do it. So, but so next week we'll talk about, I'm sure I'll have some to talk about how the funeral went and all that. But we'll talk about, we've got other things we want to talk about. We want to talk about Andor, the new Star Wars series.
Right.
That's going really well.
If you haven't watched it, highly recommend. It's really good.
Yeah. The first 3 episodes have dropped, and those first 3 episodes were really good. They're kind of unlike a lot of Star Wars, although they're a lot like Rogue One in that way. So I think that'll do it. I'm going to wrap things up here instead of meandering on. You can find us at sqpn.com/bets. That's BETTS. You can send your feedback, if you have any feedback, to our Facebook page, facebook.com/StarQuestMedia. You can send an email to bets, BETTS, at sqpn.com, or visit the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/Discord. Until next time, I'm Dom Bettinelli.
And I'm Melanie Bettinelli.
Thank you for listening to Raising the Bets on StarQuest. And remember, did anyone tell you they love you today?